I'm Indy Neidell.
And I'm Spartacus Olsson.
And this is Across the Airwaves, where we read out some of your most interesting, informative, and heartwarming comments to bring them to a wider audience.
Now, today is Valentine's Day.
That's why I said heartwarming.
And with that in mind, we thought we'd show you some comments which speak about love and relationships, not just in the romantic sense, but also in the broader one about what it means to be human.
Under our video on the Battle of Brisbane, Jeff Friedman gives us some extra information on the fun American soldiers had. There was a saying in Brisbane when the Americans arrived. There are 3 problems with the Yanks. They are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. They billeted the Americans in private homes. So here are these young women, their husbands and boyfriends away fighting in Europe and New Guinea, living with 3 or more young American soldiers. Fun, fun, fun. Many Australian soldiers got a Dear John letter while they were on the front lines saying that their wives, etc., had fallen in love with an American soldier, and many children were the result. It really was an unfair situation for everyone involved. I know I'd be pretty annoyed if my government moved in a selection of wealthy young men into my very own home while I was away fighting for my country at a time when my wife was lonely, scared, and vulnerable. Some soldiers, such as my grandfather, came back and then raised without compensation the children that were the result of such relationships. Children of American soldiers grew up never knowing who their biological fathers were. That was very interesting. I don't actually know the numbers, either specific or general, for such children, how many were actually born or how many were conceived. If anybody does know, that would be I would really love to find out. So please put it in the comments.
Under our War Against Humanity video, The Revenge Bombing of Germany, Brian Nichols shared this with us. Your use of poor Anne Frank's diary to guide us through the episode brings to mind my first reading of that slim little book. I was in 8th grade, the same age as Anne Frank, and my father purchased the book and brought it home for me to read. He explained its content, and since I loved history, I figured I'd read it. Though I thought it to be quite slim and figured I'd be done with it in a couple of days, I've always been a voracious reader, I couldn't have been more wrong. The Diary of Anne Frank took me several months to read. Knowing what had befallen Anne and her family beforehand, the book tore at my very soul. I would have to put it down and process what I had read and steel myself for my next short read. My father was a huge help to me as he explained things and helped me work through the grief I felt. My father, while not old enough to fight, had lived through those dark times. I even went to my parish priest and sought his counsel. I did finally finish the book, and it had a profound effect on my young self. I know now, 43 years later, that The Diary of Anne Frank was one of the most influential books and affected the course of my life. I've reread that slim little book several times over the intervening years, and it still always affects me deeply, as I know it must affect you and those with you who have read it. Again, I applaud your courage to face horror, process it, and then turn around and present it to the world for the express purpose of hoping we as human beings never let ourselves go down that path again. Wishing you all the best, and silly as it may sound, long-distance bear hugs. I needed lots of hugs from my mom and dad as I read that slim little book. First of all, not silly at all. Thank you very much. It really is the comments under War Against Humanity that keep me going, and the virtual bear hugs makes a big difference. So thank you for that, and I'm right back at you. Anne Frank's book had the same effect on me, as it said in the pinned comment under that video. I have to say, just like you, it never stopped having that effect on me. And I have to say, I often find myself crying when I read it, still these days. While doing the research for D-Day, I was rereading her 6th of June 1944 entry, and it's so full of hope. It's so full of life, and there's so much happiness about possibly seeing the end of this conflict. And it just breaks my heart when I read that, knowing that she will never see that liberation that she yearns so much for. So thank you for sharing that, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's one of the most important books of the 20th century, possibly of human history.
Under the weekly episode leading up to January 1st, 1943, poor Wotan has this story about his uncle. My uncle got wounded in Algeria this week at a smaller engagement called Battle of Green Hill. He would die a few days later in a German field hospital. He studied art at the University of Stuttgart, I think, when the war started, and promptly got drafted, of course. He was a freshly minted lieutenant in the German paratroops and had arrived to Africa in late November. I had a chance to read his testament 2 years ago, and it was touching to read how he left his few belongings to his then pregnant girlfriend. The handwritten wording was really beautiful. She and the baby girl survived the war, but there were no further attempts by my family to really keep in touch with her. Inheritance issues with my grandparents, out-of-wedlock children, attitude of the time. What a shame. As a side note, one of my aunts was also studying there at the same time. She was basically ordered by my grandfather to leave and go back home to Argentina after he met her then boyfriend. Ha ha ha. That was me laughing out loud. Through connections of my uncle in the Luftwaffe, she got flown into occupied France and then on to Vichy France. She then crossed the Pyrenees into Spain. Once there, she got herself to Cadiz, where she boarded the MV Cabo de Hornos y Barranquilla, a US-built ocean liner previously named President Wilson. There was a stop in Trinidad, British territory, where apparently a ship's officer helped her so that she wouldn't have problems with the British authorities. She had dual nationalities, German and Chilean. Ultimately, she arrived in Buenos Aires at the end of January 1942. Interestingly, that ship was involved in an incident on its previous South America-bound voyage. There had been 83 Jews on board looking to emigrate to South America, but no country would allow them to enter. Venezuela, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, plus Caribbean islands. So the ship was returning towards Spain, and in the last minute on this return trip, Curaçao offered to take them all in. The 83 indeed were finally able to get off the ship. Then the ship went back to Spain, where my aunt would then board for her trip. Gosh, there are thousands of stories like this. That was a very interesting story, especially that whole trek. And that's a real shame about the relations forbidding, any contact. I mean, that still happens today, but I can imagine a sign of the times, it might have happened more often. Certainly in Germany at the time, back then. That was not, of course, the only boatload of Jews hoping to emigrate and leave a very dangerous situation that was rejected or refused entry by one or many countries. We've talked about several before in the regular episodes, but even just Googling, you'll find others.
Under our War Against Humanity video, the revenge bombing of Germany, Surfer Dude 44444, I think that's it, shares this story. It doesn't quite fit the Valentine's theme, but it's about a husband and a wife and has an important message. Last fall, my wife and I visited Paris for a long weekend. We're American and I'm Jewish. We had lunch with one of my wife's former flight attendant colleagues and her French husband. Out of the blue, the guy makes the comment he's tired of seeing all the documentaries and hearing about the Shoah. It's old news and it's time to move on. I was shocked. He knew I was Jewish and my mom was a survivor. My wife was literally digging her nails in my leg to ensure I didn't make a scene. I didn't. I just made some benign remarks about its history and its need to be remembered so it doesn't happen again. I did manage to point out that the French were pretty aggressive in rounding up their Jews for their Vichy masters. His reply, fake news. I just wonder how many more like him are out there. There are a lot of nouns and adjectives I could use to describe this bleep, but I respect the time ghost and I don't want to be banned. Keep up the good work, Sparty. Never forget. And thank you, Surfer Dude, for sharing what I can only imagine to be a very painful memory. There are two components of that story. One of them is that, indeed, there are more and more people out there who do not know what the Shoah, or the Holocaust, is and why it's so important that we remember it. And even among those who do remember it, it's very hard to understand the full impact of it. I'm not Jewish myself, I might say. But I constantly find myself fighting under our videos about how important it is to this war, and the very sentiment that he expressed gets expressed not often, but often on under the videos. Among them are people saying, well, why are you talking so much about the Jews? This war is not about the Jews. And I have to say again and again, I'm sorry, but it really is, because that was the reason that the Nazis went to war. Sure, they lumped in a bunch of other people into their concept of Judaism, Bolsheviks, the capitalists, whatever that is. I never understood quite that term, but they lumped all that together and made that into something that it isn't. But in essence, it was an anti-Semitic war in Europe. That was what it was about. That was the origins of the war, and that's why it's so important that we don't forget that and that we continue hammering that message home, because that is an important realization, not just for the people who identify as Jewish of the world, but for all of us. When identity becomes the very reason for hundreds of millions of people to get embroiled in a global war, then there's something really, really wrong with how we go about things, and we need to change. And I can't say that we're there yet, but the war ended with at least a will to change and a beginning of a debate that continues to this day about how we can avoid that in the future. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is you were in France, and France has a very problematic historiography regarding the war, one that can be split in two parts. Before 1990, when I grew up in France myself, and by the way, I sort of identify as half French, we were taught that France was a victim of German aggression, and we heroically resisted against the Axis, and in the end we prevailed largely because of the resistance. Everything that countered that historiographical view was swept under the rug. Largely, of course, because people had suffered trauma themselves, and nobody wanted to look at it and say, okay, we were part of this. Beginning at the end of the 80s, but really in the beginning of the 90s, that historiography has started to change. And in the last 10, 20 years, it's changed dramatically as more and more people look at the actual events and what really happened. And there you see something troubling. That's not unique to France, by the way, and that is that anti-Semitism was widespread, and the willingness to collaborate with the German Nazis was not at all a very rare thing. That not said that France was not also a victim of Axis aggression. Of course it was. We've seen the story. We know it happened. But it's a tale that's very difficult to tell, because at the end of the day, we're not all monolithic globs of ethnicity or something. We're individuals, and within each ethnicity, within each nationality, within each language group, there are people of all kinds of opinions. So you will find anti-Semites in all walks of life, of all political color and creed. And you will find friends of humanity in all walks of life, all color and creed, and all political views. I think that's really, really important to remember. But in essence, I feel with you. I've experienced similar things myself without being Jewish. It makes my blood boil. It makes my blood boil when I see it here in the video comments as well. So never forget.
In our end-of-year video where we read out the poem Excelsior, Crispin O'Connell provides us with another great poem. We forget how evocative poetry has been in wartime, and it reminded me of something I discovered in my father's papers after he passed away. He served in the British Royal Marines in World War II and was posted to Burma. In a letter he wrote home in 1944, he included the following poem, which I believe he wrote. It may be something he found and just copied, but I cannot find any reference to it elsewhere. Despite his experience of appalling British imperialism, and he was very vocal on this, he was a very proud ex-Royal Marine. To sunset's afterglow, from thoughts of war, as I have asked before, and ask each eventide, how long, how soon, for you are in tomorrow's unborn day, beyond the sunset, half a world away.
Under our War Against Humanity episode, the Germans learned to love their slaves. Corbell reminds us of a great film quote. Dr. Ian Malcolm, life finds a way. I think it's funny that the Nazis' superior society rules were being trashed by base biological imperatives. If you put a man and a woman together, it won't matter where they are from, what they look like, or even what they believe. At some point, they will either kill each other or have sex. What can I say? I guess. I mean, love conquers all or sex conquers all? I'm not sure. There's going to be more of that as we progress into February and March with War Against Humanity, actually, where we see some resistance based on acts of love and their product.
Under our video on the home front in New York, Harper-Barnes has this declaration for us. I love that you get cold when it's 71 degrees out. I love that it takes you an hour and a half to order a sandwich. I love you get a little crinkle above your nose when you're looking at me like I'm nuts. I love that after I spend the day with you, I can still smell your perfume on my clothes. And I love that you are the last person I want to talk to before I go to sleep at night. And it's not because I'm lonely, and it's not because it's New Year's Eve. I came here tonight because when you realize you want to spend the rest of your life with somebody, you want the rest of your life to start as soon as possible. Happy Valentine's Day.
And in the spirit of that day, put your love of history on display and become a member of the Time Goes Army at patreon.com or timegoes.tv. Your membership is what keeps us bringing out these pralines and bouquets of knowledge in order that we all never forget. Excelsior!